Well, g'day everyone. It's my privilege to talk to you today, and I was actually telling the staff this morning, I sort of thought, I don't know if I've really stuck with the semester theme of changelessness, but it's actually occurred to me, and Dave Bredick actually assured me that I'd find a way to weave it in, but no, the connections become clear to me while I was teaching Hebrew and doing other things. So I think we are going to have some unchangingness in here as well. So let's begin. I'm thinking about the story of Jacob, and what motivates me to talk about that today is while we're thinking about the changelessness of God, sometimes we actually need to realise that human situations can change that we believe unchangeable. And so this all stems from the fact that in my family, my wife's family, a situation has finally changed that had been kind of locked for 15 or more years. And so this has been a really big event in our family and has involved a kind of a prodigal coming home. And the way it happened was that my father-in-law, less than a month ago, was out walking with my mother-in-law, as they regularly did. They're good maintainers of their fitness. They were out walking. He felt a little puffed, had trouble making it up the hill, and he proved to have a heart condition. After a little bit of, I think, cleaning up and general dabbling around the house, they actually called an ambulance, got to hospital, and within 3 days he was having a triple bypass, and my wife was flying up to spend time with the family. He came through the operation fine and was in kind of recovery, but it was one of those things that had come out of the blue. So this is 4 weeks ago, something like that, 3.5 weeks ago. And what we didn't see coming was, along with that, was that it precipitated a prodigal coming home to the family that had been away and virtually out of contact for more than 15 years. And it was one of those relationship problems. So sometimes this is about people changing, and sometimes it's about people dynamics. It's about relationships changing. And this kind of prodigal situation was something that we just couldn't see any solution to, we couldn't see it changing, we couldn't see what would change it. And so a near tragedy is what has produced the change. So one of my kind of character flaws, I think, sometimes can be that I can be a little bit fatalistic and just regard situations that exist as, well, that will never change. I probably give up too easily, I think, on existing situations changing. And this was a reminder to me not to assume that ruptured relationships or those kinds of things can never be mended. And this really does relate to the changelessness of God, and we're going to see that in this set of stories about Jacob, because it's the fact that God's unchangeable character means that God is working behind the scenes all the time, and sometimes is mending or providing ways for these things to be repaired or fixed that we can't see those operations, we can't see the root, and lo and behold, it proves that God has changed things unbeknownst to us. So I see two substantial changes that happen in Jacob's life and experience. And anyone who's going to be in my classroom tonight, if you're here already, long day, but this will start your head moving in the right direction. And the first change is, well, the whole story of Jacob happens in a big kind of symmetrical shape, right? It's a big V shape. You can pick things early in his story from around about Genesis 25, the second half, and you can find things that correspond at the other end, right? The whole thing is a symmetry. It's a ring structure, as they say. So there's a very difficult childbirth scene in chapter 25, Rebecca having Esau and Isaac and Jacob. And at the other end, there's Esau and Jacob. And at the other end, in chapter 35, there's a difficult birth scene as Rachel gives birth to Benjamin. And so the whole thing works in like that. So one symmetrical thing is that Jacob has a kind of a threshold experience as he flees the anger of his brother Esau, who is rightfully angry because he's gypped him twice, right? You know about that, the birthright and the blessing. So for good reason, Jacob's hitting the road and he's going back to the old country. And the reader of Genesis, if you're reading with that kind of first-time perspective, you're sort of thinking, well, hang on, this is the promised land. And so he's leaving the promised land, he's going the wrong direction. Will this kind of undo the realisation of the promises? How will this program of God ever move forward? But right on the threshold, as he leaves the land in chapter 28, he has that dream, right? The dream at Bethel. And so that's Jacob's ladder, that's the messengers of God ascending and descending. And he receives this promise in 28:13, where the Lord says, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the ground you are lying on. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you'll spread out to the west, east, north, and south. And so all families of the earth may receive blessings through you and through your descendants. I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go and bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. This stems from the Abrahamic covenant, but it's actually completely one way, isn't it? It's just a promise. Jacob has done nothing really to earn this and hasn't proven to be of wonderful character so far, and God is just choosing to grant these benefits. It's a gift. But Jacob is still a bit Jacobean, and so after getting over his shock with the significance of the place and the time, he says in verse 20, if God is with me and protects me on this journey I'm taking and gives me food to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will become my God. So in response to this grant, Jacob's going, oh, look, I think we can make a good bargain out of this. That's a really great offer. And if you come through, my part will be to be your devoted follower. So... from our angle, it doesn't look like kind of an even exchange, but Jacob is still a little bit of a deal maker, still a bit of a bargainer. We know about his complicated family life as he spends time with Laban, and the fact that Laban extracts quite a bit of labour out of Jacob, although he comes out well. So when Jacob is being driven out the other end, or when he's fled, with a good deal of Laban's kind of former wealth following him in train, Jacob complains back to Laban in 31:41, for 20 years in your house I worked like a slave for you, 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, but you changed my wages 10 times. So he has been through a very difficult road. So Jacob has been through a hard time, even though we sometimes are focused on the challenges of his wives competing in those stories. He's been through a hard time too. And he doesn't sound like the same person when he comes home. He's not the same deal maker. He's not trying to bend every situation to his own advantage. As he faces coming back and facing Esau for the first time, he's full of fear about this. To recall this emotion, just think of that last time when you had a really difficult phone call to make, or that difficult conversation where you sort of thought, I think I'm going to have to confront this person, I really don't want to have this talk. I think I've got to do it. It's the kind of conversation you can't sleep the night before and you're trembling in your shoes and you just think this is going to be super hard, right? You think of that feeling. It's a feeling we would all love to avoid as much as possible. Jacob's full of that feeling, right? He's fear from head to toe. And he thinks for these 20 years, Esau has been festering on this, and this is his chance for revenge. So Jacob's terrified to come back in the front door, come back to the promised land. And so his prayer to the Lord that in some ways corresponds to that bargain in the end of chapter 28 sounds quite different. This is 32:9. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you said to me, return to your land and to your relatives and I will make you prosper. I'm not worthy of all the faithful love you've shown your servant. With only my walking stick I crossed the Jordan, but now I've become 2 camps. Rescue me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid he will come and attack me as well as the mothers with their children. But you said, I will certainly make you prosper, and I will make your descendants like the sand on the seashore, too numerous to count. So this is nearly a Garden of Gethsemane prayer, right? This is, Lord, two things are not compatible here. The fact that my brother's getting ready to kill me and that you promised me numerous descendants and ownership in this land. So, Lord, he just kind of leaves it with him, right? That's where the prayer ends. I don't see the way forward here. This is where we are. One of these things or the other is going to happen. Now, his plan to stay safe, because he's still a plan maker, is to divide his whole household up into these parties and have them arrive separately in Esau's presence. And so if Esau gets really aggressive and hostile, well, at least, maybe that group will die, but the whole group won't. So he's going to string them all out, right? And so here's the sequence immediately following the prayer. He sends stacks of gifts come first in the form of livestock. And then after the livestock, it's going to be, the whole plan comes a little bit earlier, because he expresses that earlier in chapter 32. But after the livestock, it's going to be the families of his wives. So there'll be the concubines' families, and then Leah's family, and then Rachel and her son. And finally, he will come behind. And so it says in verse 21 of chapter 32, the gifts were sent on ahead of him. He spent the night in the camp. Then during the night he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream along with all his possessions, and then he was left alone. So he's actually going to arrive last, it seems. But he has one more difficult trial, right? So he has this wrestle that follows. And a lot of mystery is left here. It's told very compactly. But he wrestles with a man till daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not defeat Jacob, he struck the socket of his hip so that the socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated while he wrestled. And the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." "I will not let you go," Jacob replied, "unless you bless me." And then there's the exchange of, he gives Jacob a new name. Jacob is not privileged to know his. There's a lot to unpack in that. But Jacob comes away limping and changed once again. So we notice in chapter 33 what has changed. He's on the verge of this meeting with Esau, and verse 1 says, Jacob looked up and saw that Esau was coming along with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the servants and their children in front, with Leah and her children behind them, Rachel and Joseph behind them. But Jacob himself went on ahead of them and bowed toward the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. So the difference from before the wrestle is that he's actually in advance of the whole household. He crosses the ford last, but when he meets Esau, he's first. It seems to me that's probably a detail we're meant to notice, and that Jacob's whole approach to this situation has changed. Now, he's not going to send everyone ahead like a sort of a buffer for himself and his own safety. He's actually going to come in advance. He still stratifies his family according to priorities, but he comes in the lead to only discover that Esau's resentment has all faded away. And instead of a hostile reception, they have a happy embrace, greet each other, they have a good cry, and it's all forgotten. Esau's doing really well. The old resentment's gone, and all that Jacob feared is not realised. Now, we could just say, well, Esau's one of those guys who lets things go. Well, that he might be, that's good. But we saw Jacob's prayer, his nearly a Garden of Gethsemane prayer back there in chapter 32. And we realised that God had a way of fulfilling his promises to Jacob. So Jacob, looking at things humanly, was in a situation of desperation and fearing the worst. But the unchangingness of God was there in the sense that God was always at work to prevent that broken relationship from destroying all that he planned to do in that family. And so Esau was comfortable enough to more or less say, hey, let's live in adjacent houses, let's live cheek by jowl, this will be fun. And Jacob's not quite that relaxed about the relationship and says, no, look, we'd hold you up. I've got some people in the party who can't travel very fast. You go on ahead and, we'll get there. don't wait up. He's not really in a hurry to live right next door. And that reminds me of some human relationships too, right? I can imagine you being reconciled with someone that you had a big rupture from. I can also imagine that sometimes it's not the best arrangement for you to live cheek by jowl. Sometimes that relationship works best if there's a bit of distance, right? These are human realities. Jacob decides it's best if we're not next door neighbours. So that's there as well. So I don't know what it is for you in your relationship, and even if I knew all the details, I'd be scared to give you a lick of counselling because I have no training and no expertise. But sometimes we actually just assume that these human situations can't be changed. We either assume that people can't change, or we assume that their dynamics between them, the relationships can't change. And we've all seen things get worse around us. I've seen lots of relationships around me get worse in the last year or 18 months. A lot of relationships that looked good break down. So you see plenty of horror stories, but we've got to remember that the unchanging God is capable of working behind the scenes to heal wounds that were there, to heal breaches that were there. And we need to learn the kind of lesson that Jacob learned through experience, that God is able to change those things, able to heal those things. Sometimes we won't see it and sometimes we will, but let's not rule out that we ever will. Let's actually continue to seek God for those relationships and those people's hearts that worry us the most, and believe that God is capable of changing them because he is unchanging and always at work. Let's pray and then I'll invite the fellas up again. Lord, help us to believe that your hand is powerful. It's hidden, it's unseen, and so we don't credit it enough. Remind us, Lord, that you're able to take fraught and difficult situations, and maybe everybody in the room can think of one. You're able to change them. Help us to credit your power and credit your goodness and expect these kinds of things from you, and keep hoping, praying and working on these things.